Last time we spoke about the beginning of 1942 for the Eastern Front. The Red Army pushed against Army Group Center, with General Zhukov pressing to push the front back towards pre-typhoon positions, and threatening encirclements around Kaluga, Volokholamsk, and Kalinin. Soviet offensives, however, were hampered by chaotic officer training, rapid but ill-coordinated replacements, and severe winter shortages in equipment, fuel, and winter clothing, which undermined combat efficiency and morale. On the German side, there were frictions at the highest levels. Hitler's Halt orders, Guderian's resistance, and Kluge's cautious attempts to withdraw were necessary. Autonomy at lower echelons, embodied in the Aufstiegsstatik, allowed some flexible withdrawals behind the front to avoid total collapse, but high-level indecision and miscommunications contributed to disjointed German defenses and intermittent retreats. This episode is Hitler Steals the Army Trains. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front week-by-week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. Let's go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of these, you can find a mini-series covering the Battle of the Atlantic. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As 1941 drew to a close, the Soviet Tikhvin counteroffensive had finally ground to a halt, exhausted from relentless fighting. Meanwhile, Stavka shifted its focus to attempts at encirclement and destroying Army Group Center, pressing for decisive gains even as the front line buckled under pressure. They're hammered by crises from every side as the German defenses held, while the officer corps sometimes resembled an amateur drama troupe under the stress. The only major German offensive on the horizon faced an additional threat from new Soviet amphibious operations around Crimea. Since the start of the invasion, Germany had suffered 621,308 wounded, 173,722 dead, 35,873 missing, and this represented just about 26% of the Eastern Army, which was about 3.2 million strong. The Soviet casualty figures are notoriously hard to pin down, and they remain highly contested. In Colossus Reborn, historian David Glantz put total Soviet casualties for 1941 at 566,852 combat deaths, 235,339 non-combat deaths, 2,335,482 missing in action and POW, 1,256,421 wounded in action, 66,169 sick, and lastly 13,557 cases of frostbite. Other historians argue the total could be significantly higher by several million. Civilian losses in 1941 for the USSR are unknown, but estimates suggest that they were extremely heavy. Despite these staggering losses, both Stalin and Hitler remained convinced that victory could come in 1942. Stavka's optimism and its tolerance for high Soviet casualties were bolstered, in part by Soviet reports that absurdly claimed 300,000 German soldiers had been killed between December the 6th of 1941 and January the 15th of 1942. The December offensives pushed the German line back across the USSR, but this failed to capitalize on any single breakthrough. Now the Germans have reformed their front, and the push must be met again. Instead of concentrating on one focal point, the burden of the next Soviet offensives were spread across the entire Oster, extending the strain and the risk for the German defenses. General Nikolai Klebnikov in his memoirs had this to say: "Theoretically, in principle, everyone agreed that What would provide for the success of the offensive was decisive superiority over the enemy on the decisive sector of the front. However, in practice, this axiom of military theory was certainly not adhered to in all instances. It hence often happened that a well-thought-out deep thrust turned into a series of frontal attacks which only expelled the enemy, rather than resulting in encirclement and destruction. Throughout this week, Meretskav's Volkhov front continued to attack in an effort to expand their bridgeheads across the Volkhov River, but the efforts met with little success. By the 3rd of January, those bridgeheads were halted due to exhaustion and mounting fatigue. The Soviets also faced a looming logistical crisis, as Stalin's exhortations could not push them any further. Any additional offensives would have to wait. On the positive side, they had managed to drive the Germans back to their pre-Tikhvin offensive starting point, which, with the exception of the villages around Kurishi. On the downside, Soviet hopes to encircle and destroy the German offensives were failing miserably. As this unfolded, the Northwestern Front slowly prepared for its own offensive operations between Lake Idmin and Selizharovo towards Veliki Luki. The plan was to capture Domyansk and Staraya Russa, then sever Army Group North's withdrawal routes. This operation was expected to be conducted in cooperation with the Volkhov Front's next offensive. Back over in Leningrad, food supplies continued to dwindle inside the city, even as the flow of sustenance via the Road of Life showed some improvement. The situation reached a low point early January, with stockpiles down to 2 days of food and only 217,000 tons of fuel remaining. 980 tons of flour, 2.9 tons of barley, 815 tons of soybeans, 11 tons of malt, 427.7 tons of slab fat, and 1.1 tons of bran. Frantic efforts were directed at pushing the Road of Life even further. It would not be until January 18th that the ice roads would be able to meet all of the mandated norms for the Leningrad front. During this period, the ice roads faced increasing air attacks and small infantry raids from Finnish and German forces. As a result, the Leningrad front was compelled to allocate substantial rifle units and naval infantry, alongside heavy anti-aircraft emplacements, to safeguard Leningrad's lifeline. The PVO fielded 200 mid-caliber anti-aircraft guns, 50 small-caliber guns, 100 anti-aircraft machine guns, and about 100 searchlights to defend against enemy aircraft. Logistical problems also plagued Germany, of course. On December the 15th, the chief of the Wehrmacht Transport, Rudolf Gerke, reported that the Ostia required 300 trains per day to stay fully supplied. However, shortages of coal, personnel, and other shortfalls meant that only 122 trains could be sent per day by December the 17th. That figure was grossly inflated as well. In reality, only about 53 trains were sent each day. 1,643 trains arrived through the entirety of December. That's about 58 less than November for the Ostia. Back in November, Army Group Center required 31 trains for basic subsistence, but only received 16. By the end of December, Hitler would notice the stark discrepancy between promised trains and actual supply deliveries, prompted by adjutants who had visited the front. In response, all rail operations were transferred to the Reich Ministry of Transport, and as a result, the Army lost control of its own supply apparatus, handing it over to civilian administration running the occupied territories. Under the OKH, rail traffic control was chaotic at best, and at times trains simply vanished as local authorities hijacked them. The wounded froze to death on stalled hospital trains, and stockpiles were raided by divisions already low on supplies. Spare parts for repairing tanks and trucks were fiercely contested, and occasionally fighting erupted between teams dispatched by different divisions. This lack of spare parts is also a large reason why so few captured Soviet tanks were put into commission. Most of them needed repairs to be useful, but repairing the masses of broken German vehicles took priority. There was also a massive shortage of trucks and the fuel to move even that small number of vehicles. While each army was estimated to need up to 3,000 tons of supplies per day, the 2nd Panzer Army was averaging only 360 tons daily, with all other armies in a similar plight. The situation was worsened by trucks often being hijacked by divisions and sent back to Germany for supplies. In one notable instance, the 19th Panzer Division sent a truck all the way back to Spandau, that's in Berlin, to bring back utterly vital equipment, that being sausage production machinery. Despite these supply problems, copious amounts of alcohol appeared for soldiers, not at the front line, as a bitter but festive release to celebrate the new year. Alcohol provided one of the few escapes from the horrors of the Eastern Front for many on both sides. Alcohol and drug abuse would rise in Die Wehrmacht following Operation Barbarossa. 1,800 would die of alcohol or drug abuse between 1939 and 1944. Three-quarters were from denatured alcohol poisoning, and about 96% were after the invasion started. Soviet and Germans also unleashed massive artillery barrages on each other, which included flare rounds to mark the start of 1942. The diary of Franz Liebknecht read as such: "The whole section of the front began a hellish shooting. Flares of all colors brightened the sky. Yet our guns even sent a few New Year's greetings to the enemy. On the 28th, the Germans deployed a new type of shell for the first time. With these, a Panzer IV managed to knock out two 34 tanks at a range of 1 kilometer with a single shell each. General Kluge had repeatedly begged for the newly developed hollow charge warheads to be released, and it had taken until the 22nd for Halt and Hitler to be worn down. Kluge had effectively given Halt an ultimatum, insisting that unless these warheads were issued, his infantry would have no choice but to retreat from Soviet tank attacks. These shells helped alleviate the tank panic phenomenon that had plagued the German infantry in December, as confidence in their anti-tank capabilities slowly recovered. Both panzer groups endured frequent attacks, though their sector remained relatively quiet compared with their flanking armies. Their positions were well defended, protected by the Lama and Rusa rivers. Any breakthrough was met with rapid counterattacks and crushed. Both formations had been in place long enough to improve their positions, such as installing heating in the dugouts. Despite these small gains, the panzer groups were bleeding men, equipment, and supplies. Hopna sent a letter home to his wife on January the 1st that read, "The troops are screaming for replacements, munitions, and fuel." And food in particular remained a pressing concern as rations needed to be increased to offset the cold. Reinhardt stated that he needed an increase in his men's fat rations to about 75 grams a day, as well as 2 warm meals and half a loaf of bread each. In isolation, he was correct. In context, this was simply impossible with the logistical situation, which was not able to sustain even the normal ration amounts. In fact, 80% of the 46 Panzer Corps were without food and were urgently requesting Luftwaffe airdrops for rations. The diary of Otto Will, a soldier of the 5th Panzer Division, read, "We can shovel as much as we want. The road cannot be cleared. We work like crazy and still progress only gradually. Throughout the whole day, we are working without break in this weather." Kluge wanted to pull troops away from the secure panzer groups to help rescue the crisis emerging in the 9th and 4th Armies. This move fostered a perception amongst Hopna and Reinhardt that Kluge posed a greater threat to them than the Soviets. Both commanders believed themselves in extraordinarily weak positions. Hopna sent a letter home to his wife on the 1st of January that read, "I have made a reserve. The army group takes it away to fill a hole of the neighbors. They can or must always withdraw, while I am supposed to hold." They remained potentially traumatized by the extreme material losses of their winter retreats, and they were determined to avoid a repeat. Each refused to consider the wider situation outside of his own sector. Reinhardt's letter home to his wife on December the 31st read, "Both sides cause us to worry. Strauss and Hopna. We're always standing between two fires. Whether we should take the last shirt off of our backs to help, whether it really is so bad at our neighbors, or whether we should remain hard, so that we ourselves are placed in any danger. In addition, we are pressed from above. We should obviously help, because apparently there is an unexpected confidence in the panzer troops. You can just imagine how stressful this game of nerves is. We can always only tell our commanders that we are not guilty of this disquiet, and have to hope that with the help of God, everything will be well." Ultimately, Kluge was forced to bargain with Reinhardt to secure at least a single battalion, with a few tanks, to aid the collapsing 9th Army on the 31st, with Reinhardt demanding their return by latest of January the 2nd. Kluge, who at that point was a field marshal commanding 6 armies, and on paper 1.7 million soldiers, was forced to reason with Reinhardt, "That help is in your own interest and absolutely necessary, even if only a battalion with a few tanks." And this self-centered selfishness extended to sabotaging Kluge's attempts to withdraw the 9th and 4th Armies. Both commanders were desperate to maintain their river defenses, which withdrawing the two infantry armies would have required them to abandon. They bypassed Kluge to report directly to Halde that they had apparent fuel shortages, claiming that they would only be able to engage with their carbines. Leinhardt stated, "If Panzer Group 3 should have to withdraw, I'll only come with the carbines on the shoulder." Rather than facing punishment for breaching the chain of command, both were rewarded. Hauptmann was promoted to Colonel General and given Panzer Groups 3 and 4, redesignated as Panzer Armies on January the 1st. Their pettiness extended even to each other, as Leinhardt pressed Hauptmann to return the 10 tanks loaned to support the 106th Infantry Division. Hauptmann argued that the tanks could not be returned until the 5th of January at the earliest. Strauss's 9th Army would suffer through a baffling sequence of events this week as well. Last week, Kluge had granted permission for the 6th and 23rd Corps to withdraw, starting on the evening of the 27th. However, it would not be until the 29th that Kluge finally spoke with Hitler about the 9th Army's precarious situation. Hitler claimed that the two panzer groups of the 9th Army's eastern flank did not have the fuel to withdraw alongside them, and thus he outright rejected Strauss's request to withdraw to Königsberg's line. He then presented a report from Richthofen, commander of the 8th Air Corps, claiming that aerial intelligence contradicted the 9th Army's reports. Richthofen asserted that many villages the 9th Army said they had lost were still in German hands, and that the Soviets were in a full retreat after several German counterattacks. The report also apparently disputed the existence of Soviet cavalry totally raiding German supply lines, and concluded by noting that the 6th Corps commander was seemingly very nervous. This kind of comedy of a report led Hitler to conclude the problem was one of will, and he demanded an immediate replacement of Forster, despite Kluge's protests. It grew even more insane when Richthofen was deemed the best man for the job. Thus, Richthofen became commander of the 6th Army Corps alongside his role as commander of the 8th Air Corps, but he would only last 3 days before being replaced by Biela by January the 2nd. Strangely, Richthofen never interfered with Wehrmacht affairs again. It should be noted that Halde should have served as the link between the troops and Hitler, but he had long since abdicated those responsibilities. Halde's diary said, "A very difficult crisis at 9th Army, where apparently the leadership temporarily lost their nerve. This left it to Kluge to fight every political battle on behalf of the troops. OKW was becoming more like the OKH, transforming into Hitler's mouthpiece rather than representing army interests. This is underscored by Hermann Balck, who claimed in his memoirs that the Halt order was the greatest clemency to the frontline troops. I pleaded with Hitler not to withdraw under any circumstances, and this was a crisis that could not be solved operationally. The demand to hold under such conditions might sound brutal, but in reality it was the greatest clemency." This insanity left Strauss lamenting, "We will fight to the last, but I am convinced it is senseless." While Strauss was willing to fight to the death, his subordinates were not. His corps and divisional level commanders were ready to withdraw under pressure rather than remain in place. Orders of the 129th Infantry Division commander, Stefan Ritau, said, "Fight with maneuver. Inflict losses on the enemy. If necessary, abandon a few strongly attacked villages. Avoid costly counterattacks, which are not absolutely necessary. Allow enemy to accumulate. Enemy also lacks sufficient reserves." Unfettered, Kluge pressed Hitler for several hours on the 30th and 31st to allow the 9th Army to retreat. Kluge had also tried to speak with Halde, who refused to pass the information on to Hitler. Halde said to Kluge to justify his inaction, "The Führer will never agree to withdraw to a predetermined line." Kluge was unimpressed with Halde's felicitation. "We must demand that Colonel General Strauss relocate, so that a catastrophe does not result on the Staritsa front. You cannot see how the people look. If, as I have proposed for a long time, we had relocated earlier, this would have been planned and done in full order. Now this cannot be guaranteed with stricken divisions that are incessantly attacked. We are falling back, whether we want to or not." While Halde hid behind inaction, Richthofen's corps were shattered on the 31st and retreated without any authorization. Kluge sought freedom to maneuver and proposed a elastic defense, arguing that Hitler must trust him to function effectively. I ask for freedom of maneuver. You must trust me that I will do what is right. Otherwise, I cannot function. We do not only want what is best for Germany, but also for you." Hitler and Halder flatly refused. When Kluge informed Hitler that Strauss was retreating, Hitler raged and ordered the Ninth Army to defend in place. In response, Kluge seized an ambiguous wording in one of Hitler's orders to justify some freedom of movement for the beleaguered Ninth Army. Hitler would state, "It is impossible to initiate an operational movement without the approval of High Command. The troops will have to stop right where they are." He further argued that the retreats could not be explained by enemy pressure, while insisting to Strauss that any movements must be local to avoid detection by Halder and Hitler. To give permission freely in the area of division to conduct fighting withdrawals. Yet not all corps commanders shared that caution. Gablenz openly informed the Ninth Army's Chief of Staff that his corps would not stop until they reached Königsberg's line, despite Hitler's prohibitions. Even Richthofen now admitted Hitler's order was impossible, and he accepted the need for a fighting retreat. This caused Kluge's ploy to fail in the second, but his reputation meant Hitler believed the deception originated with the OKH. Halder's diary would read, "The withdrawal of the Ninth Army against the will of the Supreme Commander occasioned irate scenes at this morning's conference. The OKH is charged with having introduced parliamentary procedures in the army, lacking firm leadership. These statements, which are completely untenable criticisms, take up time and undermine fruitful cooperation." However, Hitler demanded that the Ninth Army's current position be held to the last man, no matter what. "Until the last man, without consideration for breakdowns in command at the front, without considerations for holes in the front, without consideration for responding to dangers, without consideration for supply difficulties." Kluge was forced to act against Gablenz, who refused to accept this order. If he continued to retreat while the other corps held, a corps-sized breach in the German lines would open, and disaster would follow. After Kluge's ultimatum, Gablenz resigned and was replaced by the more compliant Joachim Withoff. Kluge's ultimatum read, "I just want to tell you the following. It is the clear will of the Führer that no step backwards be taken. If you want to take the consequences for doing so, please report it. I ask only one thing. When you go, your Chief of Staff must accept the order to hold in the present line." That day, the Sixth Corps lost contact with both neighboring corps as the Soviets broke through. Counterattacks managed to restore the link to the 27th Corps. The newly arriving SS Cavalry Corps was ordered to counterattack the other breakthrough, but they would only arrive on the 7th. The week would end with Soviets flooding through the breach and threatening the important city of Rzhev. And in response to the crisis, Hitler subordinated Reinhard to Strauss. Kluge had arrived from the relative calm of the 39th Mountain Corps along the Meuse River to the calamity facing the Fourth Army. An operational breakthrough to the south, which the OKH was deliberately hiding from Hitler, had already prompted Kluge to covertly withdraw the wings of the Fourth Army last week. Soviet attacks struck the entire front and threatened a fresh breakthrough at Borovsk. Then this was on the 30th. Kluge would report, "The divisions can no longer hold. I have never had such an urgent report from the troops." Yet if Kluge wished to withdraw his line, he also needed to hold it periodically. He sought to show that withdrawals were forced by Soviet action to avoid being fired like Guderian was. He found himself trapped in a give and take between the needs of frontline commanders and the politics of high command. Thus Kluge was informed that he must hold for the time being. "In these positions we cannot capitulate too quickly." Kluge did attempt to request withdrawal permission for Kubla, but he was met by a very angry Hitler who exaggerated that the retreats would "go right back to the Polish border. Every retreat requires a loss. If this withdrawal only ends at our border, we would have no more material, and without material everything is lost." Hitler then insisted that because he endured 10-day artillery barrages in the First World War, German soldiers would simply have to endure their current conditions. This conveniently ignored that it was never negative 30 degrees in France, amongst other details. Kluge then relayed Lieutenant General Hell's comment. "The commanding general has insisted that if one ordered the 15th Division to hold, the troops would cease to do so as a result of excessive exhaustion." Hitler's only retort was, "Well, if that is the case, then it means the end of the German army." An hour later, Hitler called Kluge back, but remained obstinate. The 15th Division and the 4th Army were ordered to stay in place, yet the 98th Infantry continued to retreat despite multiple orders from multiple levels in command. As a result, its commander, Schreck, was replaced on the 31st. On the 2nd, the front line was breached between the 57th and the 2nd Corps, and a gap was rapidly widening to about 18 kilometers. Even Halde, in his diary, conceded that it was unlikely to be sealed. Meanwhile, Hitler wasted no time asking irrelevant questions of Kluge, such as how many machine guns were in action Malaya Slavet Cemetery, when the inquiry traced down to the relevant battalion and back up. This is how it read. Hitler: Field Marshal, how many machine guns are currently in action at the cemetery in Maloslavets? Kluge: I'll have someone find out right away. Mein Führer, there are 4 machine guns in action at Maloslavets Cemetery. Hitler: Field Marshal, see to it that there are at least 6 machine guns assigned there. That same day, Maloslavets was liberated by the Soviets. There was another request to withdraw, and Hitler questioned Kubla and Kluge's courage to make hard decisions. He then ordered reserves to be found from other formations. And then he assigned the front sector to Hoppner's Panzer Army to punish Kubla's perceived inability to handle the situation. This left Kubla with 5 corps, and he was being encircled from both the north and the south. The 19th Division counterattacked the Soviet breakthrough between the 43rd and 13th Army Corps on the 28th, restoring contact between the 2 corps and preventing the complete encirclement of the 43rd. Yet small groups of Soviets still remained behind the German lines. An 80-kilometer gap persisted between Kluge and Schmidt's forces, and in this space, Soviets began airdropping small teams behind the German lines, joining roving bands of cavalry that were harassing the German supply routes. Despite re-establishing contact with the 4th Army, Janicki abandoned Kluge. Kluge, however, was too important to relinquish without permission. Kluge then argued with Hitler that Yukhnov and Chinitsi were vital transport hubs that could only be defended if Kluge was sacrificed. The former 2 locations were already under threat from fast-moving Soviet forces. The 2nd Panzers and the 4th Army depended on these locations for their supply lines. Hitler initially balked at sacrificing too much equipment during the 43rd Corps' retreat, but in the end he recognized that if the corps remained at Kluge, they would be totally lost, leaving the supply routes undefended. Their retreat was authorized late on the 29th. Janicki's retreat moved through contested terrain as infantry leapfrogged from village to village, seeking shelter from the cold and Soviet fire. Small bands of retreating German troops were encircled by roving Soviet forces in a very chaotic intermingling. Some would be rescued, others would not. By the time they rallied at their new positions, ammunition had become so scarce that soldiers not at the front line were forced to surrender all but their last clip to keep the front line firing. Kluge had compelled Hoppner to send the 40th Panzer Corps south to reinforce the limp of the 4th Army. The 19th and 10th Panzer Divisions, along with the 10th Motorized Division, were reinforced by an eclectic mix of supply troops and military police. This force was to launch a major offensive to destroy the Soviet penetration. In addition, the newly arrived 216th Division was ordered to Sugenichi right in the middle of the 90-kilometer breach in the German lines, but both forces were only due to arrive next week. Schmidt's armies spent the week fortifying the new positions along the Oka and Zusha river lines as replacements arrived. Eberbache even suggested recruiting Soviet POWs and arming them with captured equipment. But this proposal was not adopted despite very desperate manpower shortages. The recruitment of Hilfsfreiwillige, or auxiliary volunteers, was already becoming increasingly widespread, even if unofficially due to Hitler's ban on any recruitment of Slavs into Die Osta. They worked jobs such as translators, drivers, medics, horse grooms, cooks, servants, and guards. The practice of arming them, however, was not as accepted, with only small groups actively being used as police forces. In his diary, Goebbels blamed the manpower shortages at the front and domestically on the Germans, who have brought too few children into the world and now must pay dearly. Soviet attacks remained frequent, but many were halted by German static positions. Those assaults that found any success were rapidly countered and destroyed by small mobile battle groups. Soviet losses were disproportionately high. Guderian's removal meant the 2nd Panzer Army could no longer ignore the Soviet offensive to its north. Its riverline positions provided a strong defensive stance, allowing German forces to withstand the Bryansk front's frontal assaults. When a Soviet thrust appeared dangerous, the German defenders briefly retreated to let the Soviets cross the river bank. Shortly thereafter, reserve forces counterattacked and surprised the Soviets and restored the front line. Captured equipment was often used to replace losses from the early retreat. For example, on the 1st, the 4th Panzer Division logged in their war diary over 1,000 enemy killed and 139 prisoners of war, while suffering only 74 casualties in a major counterattack. Raids and spoiling attacks were also frequently launched to disrupt Soviet formations. An unknown German soldier's diary entry read, "In front of us, in the direction of the enemy, is a desert zone many kilometers deep. All the villages are burnt down. The inhabitants are driven eastward. We have taken those fit for military service as prisoners." Unspeakably great misery all around. Yet these factors enabled the Panzer Army to begin sending formations north to counter the northern threat. Meanwhile, the Second Army's line stretched about 200 kilometers, leaving divisions often without firm contact with their neighbors, though Kursk and Oryol served as supply hubs behind both flanks. A Soviet tank offensive forced a limited withdrawal of the 48th Panzer Corps on January the 1st. The 9th Panzer Division could only muster about 4 serviceable tanks in support of the 16th Motorized, necessitating the stronger 3rd Panzer Division being sent south to aid in securing contact with Schmidt's forces for Army Group South. By the 3rd day of fighting, the battles had become desperate, with mobile engagements breaking out across open terrain. The cold sparked a massive frostbite outbreak amongst the 16th Motorized, the nearby 299th Infantry Division, and the attacking Soviets, with one regiment reporting 80% of its soldiers suffering frostbite. Leonid Rabitchev, a Red Army officer, had this to say, "I saw a horrifying sight. An enormous space stretching to the horizon was filled with our tanks and German tanks. In between them were thousands of sitting, standing, or crawling Russians and Germans frozen solid. Some of them were leaning against each other. Others were hugging each other. Some propping themselves with a rifle, others holding a submachine gun. It was terrible to think of the wounded, both ours and Germans, freezing to death. The front had advanced, and they had forgotten to bury these men." The Soviets continued their relatively ineffective probes against Army Group South. German intelligence detected a large Soviet buildup between Lysychansk and Kupiansk, signaling an imminent large-scale offensive towards the Dnieper. In response, Hitler reminded Army Group soldiers to take the Halt order literally and seriously. He also ordered preparations to repulse a major attack at Kharkiv and instructed the Army Group to be ready for a potential polar uprising. On January the 1st, Friedrich Paulus was appointed general of the Panzer troops and assigned to the 6th Army to replace Reichenau, who was commanding Army Group South. Last week, Topkin's plan dumped frozen and poorly supplied troops across the Kerch Peninsula. They failed to expand their bridgeheads as planned, but nonetheless they drew in German and Romanian forces. Landings at Capes Juk and Kroni were crushed by the evening of the 28th, and the remaining landings were contained by thin covering forces. Also on that same day, the second stage of Topkin's plan commenced as the winter storms abated. 2 cruisers and 8 destroyers brought the 44th Army ashore at Feodosia early on the 29th. Last week's landings had also drawn away the infantry regiment defending the port, leaving only 2 artillery battalions and 800 engineers. The defenders were taken by complete surprise, and the Luftwaffe arrived far too late to contest the landings. By the end of the day, large parts of the 3 rifle divisions that had landed were done so with remarkable speed. The Romanian 4th Mountain Brigade was ordered to form blocking positions around the port, while the 8th Cavalry Brigade was ordered to hurry back. Sponek requested permission for his corps to retreat to the Parpats Narrows, but Manstein refused. Instead, he promised to send a group from the 73rd Infantry Division and the entire 170th Division. Hitler had also promised that 50 tanks would be sent to restore the situation. In a maneuver that seemed to be a German officer's tradition, Smolensk cut communications with von Manstein, and he withdrew anyways. The 46th Division force marched 75 kilometers west. To buy time, the Romanians were ordered to attack the Soviet landing at Feodosia on the 30th, but the assault proceeded without any air artillery support, and it was easily repulsed, with the Soviets counterattacking afterwards. The 46th Division's route was then cut off at Vladislavovka on the 31st. After failing to defeat the Soviet roadblock, the division detoured cross-country through the remaining 6-mile gap between the Soviet positions and the coastline, all while contending with heavy harassment from Soviet paratroopers. By January the 1st, the 42nd Army Corps had reformed a defensive line 12 miles west of Feodosia, and then they were aligned with the 1st of Manstein's reinforcements. Kerch had been liberated as the 51st Army landed safely and began expanding from its bridgeheads. However, the 3 rifle divisions of the 44th Army were too dispersed to threaten the 42nd Corps' line until being reinforced by 4 divisions from the 51st Army. That waiting allowed the Germans to regain the initiative, and worse, Soviet forces failed to entrench themselves as the Caucasus Front commander believed the Germans were far too weak to counterattack. This delay interrupted Manstein's offensive on Sevastopol. On the 28th, Manstein had concentrated his remaining infantry, and he launched a surprisingly successful offensive, capturing a large portion of the Mekhizevi mountain sector. The arrival of the fresh 386 Rifle and 3rd Guards divisions, along with news of the Feodosia landings, would bring this offensive to a halt. Several assaults against a position the Germans dubbed Fort Stalin failed under heavy artillery fire as well. Afterwards, German forces withdrew from their more advanced positions to strengthen their line in preparation for counterattacks. In the December assault on Sevastopol, German and Romanian forces incurred nearly 10,000 casualties, leaving many divisions combat ineffective. During that same period, Petrov's coastal army suffered an estimated 17,000 casualties. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fallen Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. And if you're looking to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. German planners pressed on to hold off the advancing Soviets. They were watching as General Zhukov's forces pressed relentlessly on Army Group Center, threatening to erase the gains of earlier campaigns. The Soviets, meanwhile, contended with rear area disarray and frostbitten civilians, yet exploited every opportunity to stretch the German lines.